Mr. Chairman, when we get regulation right, we avoid disaster. When we get regulation wrong, we court disaster. Like on April 5th, 2010, when a massive methane and coal dust explosion ripped through the upper Big Branch coal mine in West Virginia of the Massey Energy Company, killing 29 miners, the country's worst coal mine disaster since 1968, when 78 people were killed in an explosion. Then, the 1968 disaster led to passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, which helped to cut workplace fatalities by 60% within 30 years. That's thousands and thousands of lives that were saved. But by 2000, right-wing propaganda and corporate greed had undermined enforcement of occupational and mine safety laws. The Massey Coal Company in West Virginia had hundreds of regulatory violations, but weak enforcement and regulatory capture meant that the company acted essentially with reckless impunity before the explosion took place. Just 15 days after that explosion rocked the mountains of West Virginia, another catastrophe rocked the Gulf of Mexico when BP's Deepwater Horizon oil drilling rig exploded and 11 people were killed there, and 200 million gallons of crude oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico in one of the worst oil spills in history. In response, the Department of Interior created the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement and put important rules in place to make sure this devastating chapter would never be repeated. But the Trump administration rolled back those regulations for creating what it called potentially unduly burdensome requirements for big oil to comply with. Now, Ms. Katzen, can you explain what the corporate crusade for deregulation means in reality, giving us a few examples?
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. I think it's fair to say that most businesses are very concerned about their bottom line, and they will seek to protect it. And to the extent that there are proposals that will increase their costs and thereby decrease their profits, that they rail against them and we've seen during different periods during President George W. Bush, there was a group that got together and came up with a wish list of regs to get rid of that had very little substance to them, and where the costs saved were minuscule compared to the benefits derived from them.
All right, and that's not because the corporations are evil. It's because they are rationally seeking their profits and they want to give the return to the shareholders. But the role of government is to regulate in the interest of the entire public, not just the people who profit from a particular business. The Clean Air Act was adopted in 1970. And in that 20-year period, it looks like the benefits were massive in terms of the health of the population, but also economically, those have been estimated to be in the range of $6 trillion to $50 trillion. That's what it's meant to our economy to have clean air in the country. So isn't the premise of regulation that it's not just going to take care of our people in terms of food safety and water safety and so on, but it's going to economically benefit all of society?
Yes, that is certainly a component of it. And while the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, it was amended in 1990 because of its success. And the provisions for EPA were strengthened and enforced because so much good had flowed from the original act.
Yeah, no, nobody likes regulation, especially when we're talking about government theocrats telling women what kind of health care they can and cannot get in different parts of the country, or trying to restrict people's travel in order to keep them from getting the health care they want. But when we say we want to get rid of regulation in the abstract, everybody would agree to that. But as you were saying before, if we're talking about dismantling Clean Air Act rules, or Clean Water Act rules, or mine safety rules, or airline safety rules, vast majorities of the American people reject that. Isn't it true that an effective, functioning regulatory state promotes the freedom of the people?
I believe it does, and it promotes the economy. It's interesting that we're talking about death by 1,000 regulations at a time when the growth of jobs in this country is terrific. We've got less unemployment than ever, and the strength of the economy is remarkable. So I'm not quite sure how these two play together very well.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes Dr.
Commend Congressman Connolly for his strong performance. And he took my reference to the jungle that I wanted to discuss today as well. But, you know, it's really just astonishing to me that we are having a hearing today about regulations, not a specific regulation, just regulations. Are they good? Should they exist? Let's dig into it. We long know that regulations are written in blood. That's very often what is communicated by people, by communities, by labor, by workers, by many more. And even now, you know, hearing a mockery of cheese, right? You have Republicans saying, oh, look at how tightly regulated our government is. We even regulate cheese. Well, pregnant women cannot eat all forms of dairy because this is a food that contains bacterial growths, and it poses risks. But perhaps if the other side of the aisle had more fluency and had more knowledge of a woman's body, perhaps they would suffer less in this policy making. Let's look at other current regulatory rollbacks the Republican Party is currently trying to pursue. Let's talk about airlines. Right now, we are seeing that lawmakers and Republicans are currently trying to push rollbacks on airline regulations. This has come with the forceful pushback from the Pilots Association, as well as communities that have suffered and who have lost families on this. But let's dive in. What we are seeing right now is Republicans trying to roll back a rule on the number of hours that pilots must require in order to train, in order to be licensed. And Ms. Katzen, are you familiar at all with the Federal Aviation Administration's 1,500-hour rule?
Very lightly, but yes, I'm aware of its requirements.
This rule requires a pilot in training to have a minimum of 1,500 hours of flight time before flying a commercial plane. Seems pretty reasonable to me. If you're dealing with thousands of people and transporting thousands of people and commanding an airplane, seems like you should have pretty thorough training. This rule was enacted not because of some bureaucrat having an idea somewhere, but it was enacted as in 2010 following the Colgan airplane crash that tragically killed 50 people near Buffalo, New York. Now, once the rule was mandated by Congress, FAA implemented the law. And we're hearing the same arguments from the other side of the aisle saying these regulations are too onerous, that it's too much of an imposition. But these families have paid the price. They have paid the price. When we see these regulations, and we have heard it themselves, including from the president of the Pilots Association, saying these regulations are written in blood. Food regulations. This committee has overseen PFAS poisoning. Communities that are often low income, that don't have anyone to protect them. Rural, urban, inner city, wherever. They are poisoned when they are not protected. And that is the actual term. People discuss the term regulation. What these are protections for people, often who have no one else to protect them, who do not have a corporate legal team to protect them, who have endured loss, who have endured disease, fertilities, cancers. This is why we have regulations. Ms. Katzen, from your experience, and expertise, even though a rule is mandated by Congress, for a rule like this to be implemented, it would still have to go through an extensive process, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And a rule like this would go through an extensive process, oftentimes to ensure safety for people, right?
Correct. And the input of those on the ground who may know more than those who are drafting the rules. So it's an informed process.
And unsurprising to no one, this regulation had a massive impact on fatalities with the pilot with the pilot hour requirement, training hour requirement. From 1990 to 2010, the FAA counted 1,720 fatalities involving passenger and cargo flights. Once the rule was finally implemented, from 2011 to 2021, the FAA counted only 14 fatalities. 14. Only 14 fatalities after implementing this rule, when the direct years prior to that, we saw 1,720 Americans dead. And yet we're here discussing rolling back a regulatory state, not even pointing out a specific area. Not even a specific area. I mean, what are we here for? I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, but the purpose of the committee hearing is to talk about many different regulations. And I'm amused that the gentlelady is concerned about raising the age, the regulation that limits the age for pilots when there's a shortage of pilots, but they're okay with a President of the United States who's more than 20 years older than the minimum age.
Mr. Chairman, since you're referring to me, it's not age, it's training hour time. The number of hours that an individual is training, not the age.
Well,